Everybody. I'm Eric Stacks. I'm a licensed cannabis farmer, and so being in the Netherlands is a dream come true. I'm very grateful to be here. I've had an affinity for cannabis my whole life, and so coming to Amsterdam has been a lifelong dream, so I'm very grateful to be here, and even more grateful that Bitcoin is the reason that I'm here. So I'm going to tell you a little story about how I got into cannabis and how cannabis led me to Bitcoin. I grew up in Southern California. My parents divorced when I was 5 years old. My mother remarried to a psychiatrist, a very credible individual within our society. My wife and my lovely wife and my daughter are here. We're all really wrecked. We just traveled quite a long ways. Not as wrecked as some people think it's valuable and okay to buy JPEGs, but, So I figured, how bad could it be? I was a little tired, a little nervous about having this speech. I'm not quite in a condition to be talking. I feel like my brain is back in Southern California, or Northern California. But, then I think about my president in my country, and that guy sounds like a buffoon, so how bad could it really be? Maybe one of the most intellectually suffering individuals on the planet. Anyways. Yeah, so my mother remarried when I was 5 years old to a psychiatrist. Some of the issues that she was dealing with in her life, some depression, led her to taking a bunch of antidepressants. And so for 15 years of her life, she's taking antidepressants. She's part of the the fiat-induced pharmaceutical, kind of scam, you could say, where you have a regulatory moat built around these chemical-based pharmaceutical products that are really, with the fiat system, it seems that bear with me here. Like I said, my brain is just back in California. So, yeah, sorry. Trying to unpack multiple thoughts at one time. Okay, so we live in a deflationary world where, I don't know if I could do this, honestly. I'm so wrecked and so tired. Yeah. Yeah, does anybody have any questions, or somebody want to join me up here and have a conversation? That would be a lot easier for me, honestly.
You have all questions?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. There you go.
There we go. Hi, I'm David, and I was fortunate enough to meet Eric on Twitter about 6 months ago when I saw some of his posts, and I thought some of his content was just world class. The passion he displays for this thing called Bitcoin we all love so much really stood out to me. So, we started commenting, I started commenting. Then we met up in Madeira, and we hung out there. Then we went to El Salvador. And I just think, the guy's doing a really good job in portraying the passion that we all have for this, this amazing protocol. So you mentioned that we live in a deflationary existence, and there's a race to kind of the marginal cost of production. Can you expand on that a little bit further?
Yeah, okay. So as a cannabis producer, cannabis has had a very high margin behind it because you've had more demand for this product than you have had supply. So as a result, the free market has bid the price up for cannabis. And that's been a large economic incentive for people to produce cannabis and for them for the supply to satiate that demand. And so the challenges that I have had as a cannabis producer with the fiat-based, debt-based monetary system is that the product that I produce is going down in value as we make it more abundant, but my cost of operating is going up, and my cost of operating is increasing. So I have dollar-denominated wage deflation and dollar-denominated inflation in my cost of operating. And so, as one of the first licensed cannabis producers in the state, at that time is when I discovered Bitcoin and I started to adopt Bitcoin as a treasury reserve. And if I didn't start saving my money in Bitcoin and have Bitcoin as a treasury reserve strategy, I would have an existential crisis. And yeah, so the appreciation that's taken place on my balance sheet is so great that it's a very effective hedge against my loss of income, you could say.
Yeah. So what's happening with other assets that you own?
I don't own any other assets. I've sold absolutely everything, including the cannabis farm, which was one of the first licensed cannabis farms in the state of California. And the reason I sold the farm was a result of discovering Bitcoin. And I've pivoted my business model to consulting. And so the videos that I make are in a greenhouse facility, which is directly across the street from the farm that I owned. So as I say, I have all the upside of operating in the cannabis business, but none of the downside.
And where are you planning to go over the next year, and how is that going to relate to your new Bitcoin journey?
Well, with the uncertainty in the world, I want to keep myself as mobile as possible, and it's another reason why I live in a rental and I don't own anything but Bitcoin, because there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think that's the most effective way to hedge yourself against the uncertainty is to have nothing but Bitcoin.
Yeah. Go on, Nasty, you have a question?
So the way you started was that your mom remarried, and I think you wanted to say something about the pharmaceutical industry. I would love to hear about that because I think it's super interesting.
Thank you. And once again, bear with me. I'm not in the best condition to be presenting my story. Yeah, so my mother got into taking pharmaceuticals, antidepressants, and the antidepressants, they didn't solve any of her problems. It was kind of like a Band-Aid. And there's a saying in the world that a patient cured is a customer lost. And so, yeah, it's by the time, God, this is the most bombing I've ever done. I feel like Joe Biden. This is incredible. God, what the fuck? Yeah. By the time I was in my mid-teens, I had watched my mother take antidepressants for 10 years of her life, and it didn't do anything to solve her problems. I would say, honestly, it made all of her problems worse. And as 15 years old is the first time that I was introduced to cannabis, and I had friends that were smoking cannabis, and so I started smoking cannabis with them. It was very clear to me that this plant was not as dangerous as the fiat world says that it is. And so I developed an affinity for cannabis. By the time I was 21 years old, my mother ended up committing suicide because she was so depressed, and the pharmaceuticals that she was using weren't solving her problems. It was like a Band-Aid, and it was a kind of a form of perpetual exploitation because of the fiat world we live in. You don't want to solve the problems of your customers, you want to continue to exploit them. And so in my mid-20s, I was invited to Northern California to trim cannabis on a cannabis farm, and I had found my calling. That was definitely what I wanted to spend my life doing, was producing cannabis. It was, for me at the time, it was a big FU to the pharmaceutical industry that had caused a lot of damage in my family. And in 2015, the governor of the state of California signed into effect a bill, the Medical Marijuana Safety Regulations Act, which put into effect the regulatory framework to license for the oncoming voting of adult use. So California went from a medical state to a recreational state. And I was in the right place at the right time to purchase a property to get a licensed cannabis farm, which for me was a dream come true. And so in 2017, I closed escrow on a property in consultation with the county and the state of California to turn that property into a licensed cannabis farm. That was the beginning of 2017, and so that at that time I had a huge economic incentive to understand what was causing the boom-bust cycles within the real estate market and in our economy, and that led me down the economic rabbit hole, which led me to hard money, which led me to Bitcoin, which really blew my mind because I was very well primed to understand the implications of having a money which has infinite demand, which is truly scarce, and as the demand goes up for this money, the supply doesn't change. And I was in a position where I'm watching the value of my product decrease significantly as the supply is satiating the demand. So as an example, 10 years ago, a bulk wholesale premier pound of cannabis was $3,000 to $4,000. Today, a better pound, honestly, is $1,000. But in that time, my cost of operating my business has doubled or tripled. So I make 1/6 to 1/12 what I used to 10 years ago. So I found myself in a position where I was a month away from being granted one of the first licenses issued by the state of California in all of history. And in that 12-month period of time, the value of the product that I was producing had lost half its value. So I was in a position where I had extreme counterparty risk with this business, and I couldn't make business plans very effectively, not knowing what the value of the product of the future was going to be. And so through the basic understanding of supply and demand and economics, I decided to pivot my business strategy and sell my farm and put all my money into Bitcoin. And if I didn't, I would have been stuck in a property that I'd honestly be upside down in. And so I can see in the marketplace that we all have different versions of the same problem. And Jeff Booth's thesis comes to mind, where we live in a deflationary world and we are effectively driving prices down on everything. And with a debt-based fiat monetary system where the monetary units are lent into existence as debt against assets, you have to have the assets that are collateralizing that debt have to go up in nominal terms, but we're fundamentally pushing those prices down by making more of everything and by making them more efficiently, which is why they keep having to further debase the currency at a faster rate to keep that that nominal value going up in a world where we're fundamentally pushing it down. If there's more demand for anything on planet Earth, humans are going to figure out how to make more of it. And the free market will bid the price up. As the price goes up, the economic incentive to produce more of that thing goes up, and that pushes the price down. But in the fiat world, you have to have prices of everything go up. And so the best way to hedge against that deflationary that inflationary conundrum in a deflationary world is have the apex property on the balance sheet as a Treasury reserve strategy. And in my case, in the United States, spending Bitcoin is very difficult, and it creates a tax nightmare, because you have a taxable event every time you make a purchase. So currently, it's very fascinating being in a place where people are paying for things with Bitcoin. In my case, it's not prudent for me to do so, but the Treasury reserve strategy is really, really important.
Who do you think's inspired you the most along the way?
I would say Jeff Booth and Michael Saylor. So when the Saylor series hit, it helped me to understand commoditization and the fundamental opposing forces that I was dealing with that intuitively I knew were wrecking my business and making me poor. Just like he says, the road to serfdom is working exponentially harder for a currency growing exponentially weaker. And so without that Treasury reserve strategy, when Saylor hit the scene, my mind exploded. Like, it blew my mind. It legitimized this thing that I already had such a fascination with, and I basically panic sold the rest of everything else that I had that had any economic energy stored up in it. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any other questions?
Yeah. I can talk.
Yeah.
If it will reach.
Okay, so like this. So you were mentioning Saylor and of course Jeff Booth. You almost certainly know also Saifedean Amnous from the Bitcoin Standard, and after that he wrote of course the Fiat Standard. And in the Fiat Standard you learn how fiat is like the evil of everything, like fiat science for whatever. And Fiat Food, it was a book that was later also produced by Saifedean Amnous. And I was wondering, like, how much do you think, like, all the narratives around cannabis, because you were mentioning cannabis, and the science that sort of, quote-unquote, proves that cannabis is not good for you, or that it's, like even bad for you? Because all those narratives are still flying around in the Netherlands even, where it's, like, legitimized also. How do you think this has affected that narrative as well, that whole fiat system of cannabis?
So I think that cannabis prohibition in the United States, and thank you for the participation and the assistance and the understanding here. I think that the cannabis prohibition coincided the debasement of the currency, or the further debasement relative to the underlying money, which was gold. So as the amount of currency that they release based upon how much gold is back, that's been debased over the last 100 years significantly. And the FUD, I would call it, around cannabis and how bad it's for you was directly related to that debasement, in the sense that it's driving people into the Rockefeller-funded pharmaceutical industry. Gosh, how do I unpack that thought? Yeah, I think it's just directly fiat-induced FUD, because if you can't continue to exploit your customers to continue to pull perpetual profits out of them, it's like it goes back to a patient cured as a customer lost. And so I think that that's the fiat system at large, continuing to keep people stuck within it so that they don't liberate themselves and heal themselves and solve those problems. Living in Humboldt County for the last 15 years, I have heard and seen countless stories of people using cannabis oil and healing things like stage 4 cancer. And so it's a threat to the fiat paradigm. But I also would say that the legalization of cannabis is related to the fact that as the currency is debased, the cost of operating for the government that's behind the monetary policy of debasing the currency, their cost of operating goes up, so it's harder for them to make their margins. It's this feedback loop of more regulations and more taxes, and more regulations and more taxes to enforce those regulations. Yeah.
Yeah, good. Anyone else? You got a question?
Oh, yeah, they need more tax revenue, of course. So it's this huge multi-billion-dollar industry that they can then charge licensing fees and more taxes to. Yeah.
You are a licensed cannabis farmer and turned consultant, right? And now you're consulting other licensed cannabis farmers. Are you recommending them to become consultants for licensed cannabis farmers? Or
No, I recommend that they...
how does that work?
Yeah, I recommend that they put all of their surplus, which is becoming progressively harder to make, into Bitcoin. Yeah, and so one of the issues with the cannabis industry is that there's no fiat leverage available. You can't go to the bank and get a business loan, so it's all hard money loans. And so what has happened is the boom-bust cycle, and especially with cannabis, there was this monumental green rush in the state of California, where a bunch of people came into the state and they bought property and they paid enormous fees to get through the regulatory process to get licensed. And so what's happened is a lot of these people are upside down in their properties, where they owe more than what they can sell the properties for, so they're kind of stuck continuing to produce. It's like a race to the bottom in some sense. And so I definitely encourage all of my cannabis farming friends to adopt Bitcoin as a Treasury Reserve strategy, which there is a big resistance to that, which is quite shocking, because I would say that within the marketplace in the States, it's one of the sectors that would benefit the most from a Bitcoin standard, a quasi-Bitcoin standard, in the sense that you can't go around and pay your bills with Bitcoin, unfortunately, due to the taxable events.
Just a quick one, Eric. I think a lot of people here have seen your videos. You've been on Twitter. You've been doing for maybe 6-7 months now. What made you start doing them?
Well, I went to Pacific Bitcoin, and that was actually the first time I was around any other Bitcoiners in real life. I've lived in this quiet little bubble in Northern California as this hardcore Bitcoin maximalist, and I don't know any other Bitcoiners. And I had just got onto Twitter at the time, and I woke up one day, like a week before the conference, and I told my wife, like, look, I'm losing my mind. Like, I need to go meet some other Bitcoiners. And in participating in that conference and being around so many other people who have such rational optimism, as American Hodel says, the vibe was so empowering. Yeah, it was just it was a quite an incredible thing. And leaving Pacific Bitcoin, when I got home, that's when the conflict in the Middle East broke out. And my understanding of Bitcoin and how fiat funds war, and I'm looking at my 2-year-old daughter, and I'm looking at people getting blown to smithereens. Although I do believe that the fact that I'm all in on Bitcoin, that's a very revolutionary thing to do. I wanted to participate in some other way and become more of an active participant as opposed to a passive observer. Like I listen to Bitcoin content all day long. I don't even listen to music. There's too many riveting conversations to listen to. I don't have time to listen to music. So I wanted to expand my conversational reach and make friends like David here, you know, and connections around the world. So I started making videos, walking around my greenhouse, talking about, you know, the philosophical and societal implications of Bitcoin, which brought me here to the Netherlands, which is quite amazing.
Yeah, thank you for coming. We really appreciate it. Anyone else have any other questions? Quite a crowd here. Come on, guys.
Does smoking cannabis help understand Bitcoin better?
Great question.
I would say so. And for me, I feel that ingesting cannabis, whether you're going to eat edibles or smoke it, cannabis has a very interesting modulatory, I would call it a modulatory effect, where I find that at times we can get too micro-focused on things in our life and too stuck on certain particular things. And sometimes we can be too macro-focused and we can overlook things that we should be paying attention to, blind spots in our life. And so I find, and actually, for being a cannabis producer and a cannabis enthusiast, I go periods of time in my life where I don't ingest any cannabis. And when I do, especially after a long period of time of not ingesting any cannabis, it recalibrates me. It's this very interesting thing where I will ingest cannabis and have those feelings of like, oh, I'm not drinking enough water, or I'm not eating well, or I'm not sleeping enough, or maybe I've been a little bit too hubristic or too focused and obsessed on certain things that I should let go of, or maybe I'm overlooking things that are very important. So it does have this powerful effect, and that does relate directly to Bitcoin, because we all have this economic conundrum of working harder and harder and harder for a currency that's growing weaker and weaker and weaker in a world where we are making more of everything, but we have this debt-based fiat monetary system, a Keynesian lie that says that we have to expand the currency to keep stimulating the economic flow of things.
One more question. So one final question. We all know that you can't change Bitcoin, but Bitcoin changes you. How else has it changed you? What other aspects of your life have you changed because of Bitcoin?
I would say that I have let go of... I have let go of the need, the focus and the concern around being so wrapped up in taking care of all the material things in our world. In the cannabis business, top-tier cannabis is considered top shelf or AAA, and mid-tier cannabis is considered mids. So as an example, when I compare like a metaphysical or digital finite scarce property like Bitcoin to real estate, you start to think and realize that real estate is mids. It is an inferior monetary instrument. It's like a car. You need to drive a car if you need to, some places you don't need a car, but you need to live in a house. But the fact that people have been treating homes as savings accounts is pretty interesting, and if you think about it, and it's Jeff Booth's quote comes to mind, where you have scarcity and money, you create abundance and everything else, and where you have abundance and money, you create scarcity and everything else, where the incentive is to hold assets that are more scarce than the money. And when I look around the world, and I have friends that are continuing to purchase more property, and I'm looking at these properties, that like, this is a bleeding asset. Like, this is a much inferior asset to Bitcoin and the economic. So if you have an increase in property values in a particular area, there's more demand for somebody to move to a new area, then there's more of an incentive to build more houses, which is dilutive of the houses in that area. So I think over time, we're in the midst of the great demonetization, and we have all this economic energy coming out of asset classes and going away from asset classes like real estate and into Bitcoin. And so, yeah, my understanding of Bitcoin has completely changed the way that I look at the world. I used to look at the world from a place of, I want these things that I can't have or they're hard to get. And now I look at them and I think to myself, I could have them, but I don't want them, which really flips it on its head and it's very empowering.
Thank you very much. Mr.
Thank you.
Eric V. Stacks, thank you very much.